Just like many other industries are dominated by a handful of different companies operating many distinct brands which appear to be fully independent but actually aren't, I mean everything from opticians to food companies operate along these lines, there's a trend in the auto industry towards ever larger automaker partnerships and merger deals that end up creating what I'm going to call mega automakers. These automakers own many brands, and while they may compete against each other openly in the marketplace, they're all intrinsically linked behind the scenes. Peugeot and Citroën are good examples of this, as too are Renault, Nissan, and more recently Mitsubishi. The ways each partnership or merger is carried out vary slightly from situation to situation. Some are mergers and some are partnerships, but the idea behind them is usually to do the same, to pull resources available across different brands and different segments, and in some cases, other things, like green car credits. Fiat Chrysler is another automaker formed by the merger of two different companies, Fiat and Chrysler, in 2014. Collaboratively, they own a variety of different brands, from European brands like Fiat, Lancia, Maserati and Alfa Romeo, and then all-American brands like Chrysler, Ram, Jeep and Dodge. And to date, each of these brands haven't really done a whole lot when it comes to plug-in vehicles. Sure, Fiat made the 500e for the US market in limited numbers, something its former CEO, the late Sergio Marchionne, complained bitterly about, and Chrysler does still make the Pacifica plug-in hybrid minivan. Although, as many of you have complained to us, you can't actually get hold of them. But save for these two exceptions, well, there's not a lot going on with plug-in plans at FCA. And that causes problems because in markets where it's expected to offer at least some form of plug-in vehicles, Fiat Chrysler is SOL. Sure, it's planning a new next-generation all-electric Fiat 500 for Europe, and it's promising plug-in hybrid Jeep models in the next year or two. But this isn't just about having to make plug-in cars to satisfy zero-emission vehicle mandates. This is about making lower-emission cars to satisfy corporate average fuel economy targets around the globe. In the US and in Europe, automakers are expected to have corporate average fuel economies that reach a set target. And without getting too much into the weeds about this, I can explain it pretty simply. And why, just months after expressed intense interest in buying Renault in a merger that could have made it one of the largest automakers in the world, FCA is at it again, but this time with French automaker PSA, the company that owns Peugeot and Citroën, as well as Opel and Vauxhall brands, which PSA recently acquired from General Motors. Combined, this would make it the fourth largest mega automaker. But before we get there, let's do some explaining. Essentially, regulations require, if you add up all of the fuel economies of all of the cars that an automaker sells and then average them out, they must meet a particular target. Most automakers use plug-ins, hybrids, and sometimes super efficient internal combustion engine vehicles to even out the emissions of their larger, less efficient gas-guzzling models. In FCA's case, however, a huge part of its portfolio are actually gas guzzlers. Jeep, Ram and Dodge all rely on large, powerful engines that aren't anywhere near as fuel efficient as perhaps they ought to be. FCA's muscle cars, for example, are the epitome of an anti-green fuel guzzling car. And yet they're popular. Just like the pickups and the entire Jeep family, FCA makes a lot of money on them. And its customers want it to continue making them, which gives FCA a major problem. It wants to keep its high-performance gas-guzzling SUVs, pickups and muscle cars in its lineups because they're popular and are selling, but it also needs plug-in models to even out those emissions of those monstrous gas guzzlers. Most automakers now have at least some models they can use to even out those emissions, but FCA, not so much. Which is why I think it's been so interested in PSA and Renault before it. The Renault deal has, of course, long since fallen through, but now PSA and FCA are said to be in agreement about establishing a joint venture that would see PSA and FCA each hold a 50% stake. What follows is conjecture, but based on what I know of the auto industry, I think it's where this particular merger will head and why it will head there. Interestingly, FCA and PSA say they're both going to continue to develop and sell their own electric vehicle platforms, in much the same way that Nissan and Renault have different platforms. And that makes sense for now, since FCA is said to be unveiling its all-new electric Fiat 500e at next year's Geneva Motor Show, and PSA has just launched the new Opel e-Corsa and Peugeot e-208, both of which are essentially the same car underneath. But even if these two platforms develop independent plug-in vehicles for now, the combined purchasing clout of this new mega automaker could give FCA the leg up it needs to bring its electric vehicle lineup to at least par with some of its rivals, without the massive losses that its former CEO complained so famously and so bitterly about with that first-generation Fiat 500e. More likely, though, I think this is also a way out for Fiat Chrysler, which is currently relying on Tesla in Europe to ensure it meets European emissions regulations. It's essentially buying Tesla's emission credits to offset its own poor fleet-wide emissions, and thus avoiding hefty fines in the process. Given none of PSA's brands are on sale in the US, I'm not sure how corporate average fuel economies will be affected stateside. But if FCA can rebadge some of PSA's models and sell in the US in large enough volumes to satisfy CAFE regulations, they'd be sold as Fiats, probably not Peugeots or Citroëns. I'd wager it probably would help. Just so it can continue to sell those tyre-shedding muscle cars that its hardened fans are so eager to buy because they're so scared of electric vehicles replacing them. That's it. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.